Welcome back to Crafted Reality, a podcast by Yellow Brick. This month, Julian and I sit down and chat about our recent R&D project, Gentle Gathering. A project that brings together AI and food and how it can bring people together to have more meaningful conversations. We talk a little bit about the project, where we are now, and where we hope to take it in the future. We hope you enjoy. And don't forget, if you are enjoying Crafted Reality, you can support us on our Patreon. All of the information is in the show notes.
Okay.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Season 2, episode 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just the start of, well, maybe a week and a bit into February, and none of us have seen the sun for a month and a half.
It's really ironic that you're saying that now, because the sun is
beaming
coming
through the window.
Starting to come out through the window.
It just seems to be you're always in the office when it's happening. It's it feels quite depressing at the minute. Mm. But having said that, it has started to get a little bit lighter after work, so that's kind of all good. And I think this episode we said, based on the last episode, that we were going to talk about one of our projects called Gentle Gathering. Would help if I could say it. Maybe discuss a little bit about what it is and some of the things we're thinking about. And then we've got 3 other sections that we'll either release all as one episode, or maybe we'll break them down so they're weekly rather than monthly.
Ooh.
I guess we just don't know yet, do we? I guess it depends on how much content we talk about.
That we create together.
Yeah, exactly. So, starting off on Gentle Gathering, we managed to secure some funding from Media Cymru, initially for a little bit of R&D around it initially, and then we've got a little bit more to try and develop that into, I guess, more of a product, not necessarily definitively a finished thing, but at least to start trying things out a bit more practically and stuff like that. Would that be kind of fair to say?
I think that is quite accurate.
And so if you were to describe Gentle Gathering to someone, how would you describe it?
Okay, so I would say Gentle Gathering is an experience that uses food and technology to bring people together to have meaningful conversation and create meaningful connection. So when we started off with the initial R&D, we knew that we were interested in bringing people together in a unique and maybe quite novel way. And I think we were really keen that part of that bringing together was food, so that a sharing of food around a table kind of eases that sense of communal gathering and hopefully kind of free flow of conversation. So was our starting point for the project way back, maybe not last year, the year before. I think we'd started our initial sort of journey through this R&D. So that initial R&D looked very much at how can we use technology then as a way to help us engage people within that sort of setting. And we were quite sort of intrigued by the potential of, controversially, I suppose, in many people's minds, looking at AI and how that could be a tool as a way to sort of help facilitate conversation. But I think what we were really keen on doing was keeping the human in the loop within that setting. So it wasn't something that would be solely an AI-driven experience, that there would be somebody within that setting to sort of help sort of be the host. So as we kind of moved through our initial R&D period, it sort of came into being that it's a sort of experience that is hosted by a facilitator with almost like this sidekick companion who we've provisionally called Graham. I don't know why. I can't remember why.
Wasn't that because of an old TV series?
Yeah, well, I think somebody we'd spoken to was like, oh, isn't it like Graham from Blind Date with Cilla Black? This is back in the 80s, 90s, which may be on a subconscious level, because I guess we grew up with that TV, potentially. Yes, we were influenced by that somehow. So we played about with this idea then of human host and our AI co-host hosting this sort of, I guess, gathering of people and sharing a connection over food. So that's sort of how it developed during that initial phase R&D. And then I guess from there it's grown, where we wanted the piece, or we wanted the project to help people have, I guess, difficult conversations, was, I guess, our initial thinking around it. And I suppose to enable that without it becoming almost too confrontational, we thought a lot about how the format of the experience would enable free conversation without it feeling too kind of confrontational between people.
Yeah, so I guess if we kind of like go back a little bit from that, to your point earlier, there was, I guess there was a desire at the beginning, or there was something at the start of the project, way before we got the initial money to do the very early stages research and discovery, that we wanted to see if there were ways of bringing people together that ideally, well, not ideally, but maybe don't necessarily know each other, or in some respects potentially have different points of view. And we were wanting to explore whether those people could be brought together and in the very least share each other's opinions without it being extreme one way or the other, and it's just felt like within the social media platforms and things like that, it's almost black and white. There's no grey in the middle. So in many ways we were trying to make things grey, and open up understanding between people. So I think that was kind of like the crux of it. And I think one of the analogies we've always thought about way back when we were talking about games and things like that was that kind of bus stop conversation, wasn't it? Where we are at a bus stop, we are slightly, as an individual, out of our comfort zone because it's not our space, it's kind of neutral space. And sometimes that opens you up to conversations with people that you wouldn't normally converse with, because you're in a way having a shared experience. So I think that was kind of like the nebulous of it, if you like. And then I guess to your point, the AI was a way, well, that was the R&D bit. Yeah. Because really we could have done that, have done that in many ways, in the sense of games and workshop facilitation. The AI bit is the R&D bit of it. In the realms of, I guess at one end, just a really basic fact-checking system, which if you imagine doing that, unless you had a lot of people in the workshop, if you imagine doing that in real time, would be very clunky, and you'd kind of get a lot of pauses. Your workshop would go from 1 hour to 4 hours because you'd be like, oh, can someone fact check that for me? Get back, that kind of thing. So I think there's an element of that. I think there's also an element of, while we can be great facilitators, the AI can almost be a listener that then documents as well. And that's part of the process, isn't it, for that AI to reflect back when people have said things. And so to your point earlier again, it wasn't AI to replace someone. It was to accompany them and support them and kind of do the things that a human really couldn't do, like an individual human. Because at the end of the day, we are trying to make something that maybe is viable to potentially sell as a workshop or sell as an experience. So it's not like we could have 20 people. So I think that was kind of like the AI bit, if that makes sense. And then I think the two other things is, in a sense, the bus stop in some ways came in the guise of food and a meal. So the idea of sharing, the idea of the meal and those kind of things. But I wanted to ask you about another element of that, where we had all of that, but we didn't really have content, if you like, for the workshop. And so we created, ironically, very originally named The Table. So what do you think what was your thinking along those lines for kind of creating The Table, and maybe just give us an indication or a description of kind of what that is?
Yeah, so I suppose kind of leaning into other work that we've done and being influenced by that, and knowing that playful formats or playful experiences are kind of things that also can put people on a level playing field. They can put people at ease. So I guess that particular format where we imagined when people arrived that they are seated at a table, but then a kind of another layer on top of that is that, and now as the evening unfolds over the 3 courses of food that the people would have, they are sort of kind of the community leaders of this village of table, which is in front of them. And as the evening unfolds, different scenarios within this imaginary space that is quite similar to a place that you know, or even a place that you live, scenarios pop up, and the idea is that people then have to discuss that scenario and kind of come up with a general consensus of how to move forward within that scenario. So there's kind of no right or wrong in what they decide, but those scenarios spur conversation. They offer topics and themes that then those people can kind of then discuss and understand what they want to do within that. And I guess what the AI currently does within that, the AI generates those scenarios for us. So we don't necessarily know exactly what the scenario is going to be. So it's kind of feels kind of quite live and quite organic in that sense of how it unfolds. Sorry,
so that clearly didn't work, did it? Yeah.
So just to explain, my phone, I had put it on airplane mode and do not disturb, and yet still a text message comes through. So the AI sort of generates those scenarios so they kind of feel really sort of live and kind of quite organic, and are sort of then responsive to the conversation that takes place then within that evening. So
the facilitator, or maitre d', as we kind of started talking about them, also really doesn't know.
Yes.
But they're not totally random, or the idea is they shouldn't totally be random, right?
No.
So we've collected information about the people who are coming to table on that evening.
Yeah. And
we've kind of passed that into the AI, and we've asked the AI to try and make scenarios that it feels will challenge those people. And like you say, there's not necessarily a win or a lose. And in many cases, I guess this is the point, there are a lot of grey decisions which are along the lines of, well, if we do this, then we won't be able to do that. But in a general sense, we think this is the better way forward. And again, that feels far more realistic than there being an absolute win or an absolute lose.
And I think we felt it was important to have that sort of abstraction, I suppose, so that there isn't a necessary kind of full-on sense of it being too personal.
And you mean abstraction in the sense that it is the village is called Table. It's not their village.
Yeah.
While they can draw comparisons from, and many did, like some people were going through very similar subject matter, if not the same, in their town, village, or city. It was deliberately abstracted so people kind of maybe could free their opinion.
Yeah, and I think, it comes back to the stuff that we've talked about LARPing, so live action role play, and sort of being within game spaces that enable you a little bit more freedom to sort of maybe unpick more of the themes. It allows you to play maybe different kind of roles or hold, different value sets to explore, well, if we did do that, what would happen in a kind of very sort of low risk environment. But it kind of gives you the ability to have the freedom to, explore a version of reality that is similar to your own, but it's kind of in a more sort of secure space or safer space to kind of understand sort of other people's perspectives and maybe to sort of understand your own perspective a little bit more. That makes sense?
Yeah. And if it wasn't clear already, Ali was the maitre d' or the facilitator of the workshops we've done up to this point. How do you think the breaking up of those, so in effect, if you to break it down in terms of a workshop, what we'd have said is that there's a number of workshop exercises, and then in between each exercise there's a course. So there's three courses: starter, main, and dessert. And I think that, and then there's technically a fourth at the end, which is kind of a cup of tea, which, because we're doing R&D, there is an element of feedback that we're trying to gain as well from the experience. So we're unsure whether that's actually going to be in the main, but actually it feels like that decompression, if you like, was quite important, fortuitously, for it wasn't designed like that. But in terms of the food, do you think it had value within the scenario? Like, why didn't we just do, beyond what we said about the kind of sharing, but were there other things that you saw when you were in there facilitating that the food kind of did?
Yeah, I think there's something about sitting at a table and feeling like perhaps you've gone to someone's home to have some, a meal, and that kind of intimacy. So the setting that we had was, we've got a space in our office downstairs, which kind of really looks like a living room, really, in terms of its setup and its size. So you kind of, I guess, immediately maybe have that sense of, you're going to someone's house for dinner. And what we really wanted to explore was not only kind of that sense of physically being around a table with other people, but then also, the passing of food or elements to each other, which is kind of what we did with some of the courses, so that, there is this communal sense of, coming and having some supper with friends. And I think we described in the call out that we did for people to come and try the experience, it's sort of part supper club, part thought experiment almost. So that kind of literal kind of handing to each other of food and that communal sense of sharing, I think, was really important. And it does, again, provide, I think, another layer of metaphorical connection, because you're eating the same food, it's nourishing, it's sort of feeding the soul, and you're sharing that with people that you don't know. And it's also kind of like a little bit of a safety net initially, as people warm up to the evening, you do have something that immediately unifies people around the table.
Yeah, and I guess off of that, I think one of the things that we did at the start of this experience, and maybe would stop someone from having their comfort blanket, if you like, we did ask people to just pop their phones on the shelf, so they weren't looking at their phone for the duration. With some quite funny ones kind of coming at the end of that when they'd totally forgotten they'd not been looking at their phone for 2 hours, and they'd had about 59 messages because people were that had changed their behavior so much because they were always on their phone. So some of those kind of things were obviously quite interesting in terms of how some people, it felt, at least from my perspective, seeing some of the people at the end, that there was a lightness to them because they hadn't been, like, they hadn't hidden in their phone, and they'd like you say, they'd used the food and the sharing of food elements to in effect introduce each other to each other, as well as through the opinions that they're kind of raising within the experience.
Because I think you're right. You know, the phone is a wonder and then also a curse, isn't it? It's something that connects us implicitly to each other and to the wider world. And in other respects, then it is such a kind of heavy burden equally as well, isn't it? That we've become so used to having that phone in the palm of our hand more often than not in many different scenarios. And I think getting people to put that to one side and actually look up and look at each other when, you know, you're talking, so that is going back to a practice of active listening and, you know, being present in the room without something that is a consistent distraction. I mean, just like a minute ago, my phone beeped, and that's, you know, distracting from this very conversation that we've had, you know, already. So I think it's, as you were saying, I quite like the idea of, you know, that unburdening or lifting of that, and not having to think about the phone or the outside world for that hour or hour and a half or 2 hours. I think the experience ended up being about 2 hours in the end. I think is really, really rare. I can't think of any scenarios where I don't have my phone on me, apart from maybe when I'm going to a yoga class. So I think that as well is very much part of the experience. It's a reconnection to other people, but it's a disconnection from other aspects of your life that, you know, I think can feel way quite heavy.
And we've been working with Jorge Lizalde through the entire project, and he's been kind of we've all been kind of partnering to kind of create the overall experience together. And I think as three of us have always had the desire to maybe see how one workshop builds onto another workshop. So that is the idea of cause and effect, if you like. Almost like in a game scenario where one table decides on some things, and then maybe three tables later, that scenario is replayed with some decisions that have been made. So the idea that maybe just like in a kind of game, you might see a village change and evolve based on decisions that have been made. And I think that's maybe a big part of what the kind of second part of the R&D, because just to be clear, we're very much kind of a third of the way through the second block of R&D. So we kind of almost got to what we've been describing up to this point in that initial bit and this first third. And so the desire now is to kind of maybe look at how we could show something through time, show a village called the table through time. There are a number of other kind of elements that we want to explore specifically that are kind of granular in terms of the AI and its robustness and its responsiveness and how it stores information and things like that. But the idea that we could almost develop a village based on what people have decided, show the cause and consequence of that, and then kind of make new decisions on top and affect those. And maybe, and I guess a big part of it that we're thinking about now is how we visualize that, or do we visualize it? So whether that's through on screen or projection mapping or something like that, could they see, almost like those kind of old 80s, 90s games, see something developing and evolving based on what we say? It's kind of like anything from the old games like Populous through to SimCity and those kind of things, and just seeing if there's a way of kind of helping embellish the story is kind of really interesting for us, I think, now. And maybe kind of looking at the level of that. So whether it's that gamey, like we just said, or whether it's more like an exhibition that, you kind of walk through before you come to your dinner. We're not sure. And I think that's some of the stuff that we want to explore.
And I think kind of going back to, I think, a point you sort of had made earlier, that the technology that we are using is an enrichment of the experience, rather than it being an obstacle within it. And I suppose we've got, Graham very much as a voice in the room that is responsive, and kind of reactive to what is said around the table. And part of what we're also looking at is how we, to a degree, control that, in when it listens and then when it speaks, or when we actually want moments where it has slightly more free reign, is sort of part of maybe some of the technical challenges that we're also trying to think about in terms of addressing in how the running of the evening goes, because there are certain markers within the evening we sort of need to hit in terms of the timings of the courses, of the food, marrying with the timing of some of the scenarios and then the content and kind of that flow of conversation, and sort of looking at how that timekeeping element works as well. Otherwise, I think we'd probably be there for like 2-3 more hours more on top of the 2 hours that we were already currently running at.
Yeah, I think even in the short period of time that we've run the project, and I think technically we've gone through 3, maybe 4 different versions or AI versions. And even in that time, the AI is changing so quickly that when we talk about using the AI, what we're meaning is that we're talking to it and it's talking back. So not through text, it's literally kind of talking back to us. So that idea of listening, thinking, all those kind of things that we take for granted is something that we have to teach it, and we have to be able to build it so that it does feel, for want of a better word, more human. But even in those 3 or 4 versions that we've used, the characteristics and the influences and the way it does stuff has changed massively. Sometimes it's been quite direct and kind of really felt like that's exactly the character we wanted, and then other times it's been so, I guess, almost meek that it's never really given us a decision. It's just given us loads of options and just kept on repeating that back. So beyond the actual purely technical elements, there is this kind of desire to build something that fits within the characteristics of the experience. And I think it kind of reminds me, to your point a little bit about technology, it reminds me of a recent video I watched with regards to Disney's Imagineer kind of area, where they're building technologies specifically for certain things within their, I guess, attractions and parks and things like that. And it's interesting because their goal of their technology is in effect to immerse or to cause joy or play or, that kind of thing. So, their robots or their lightsabers that they've kind of built, they're there for the experience and the awe. And it's rare really when you think about the technology these days to be built for any other reason than efficiency. And I guess while we're looking at the AI for elements of efficiency, like we spoke about with terms of bringing lots of data together and then making an opinion, or recording or listening and then kind of summarizing for us or fact checking, as we kind of developed it, it became much more obvious that we were making an experience just as much as we were making something that was, I guess, a clinical workshop. And there were elements that we needed to do that were deliberately humorous or fun or enjoyable, because, the food could be great or whatever, or the company could be great, but without that, it kind of like disappears. And I think some of the biggest, more interesting moments have been when the AI has kind of like done something that's a bit off the wall, or they've had a different perspective to everyone in the room, and that's kind of challenging in a good way. So it's not purely about efficiency. I think there's something that we've, I guess, tried to pull in from our other ideas on technology, where whenever we've built something, we've often talked about we're bringing that technology to help story or to help the immersion. And I think that's a similar thing, but maybe just slightly different, because we're more in the workshop realm currently. And I guess maybe you could talk to, I guess, those two versions of what we're thinking about, where there is almost like this version where actually we could go even more theatrical, and then another version that we feel maybe is a bit more towards the idea of a commercial workshop, if you like.
Yeah, so I guess we're sort of dancing between those two ways of thinking.
And whether they even need to.
Yeah, exactly. So, one, I guess, as artists, we are interested in, I guess, the experience version of it, where people come, they have a good time, they go away maybe slightly altered in a positive sense, and that goes out into the world, and then you have that ripple effect of that positive impact, and then the other side of things in a very different way in terms of that positive impact, looking at a model of workshopping that potentially could be used within community settings or business settings, that is still about bringing people together and offering perspective and trying to help people understand each other, but it's perhaps a sort of different offering in terms of what that is there to do as an output of a workshop. By the end of this workshop, we hope that. So I guess there's a different or extra added part of what that workshop is trying to do.
Yeah, I guess there's also, within those two versions we just kind of like briefly broke down, there's also conversations as to whether we'd make the workshop more specific.
Yeah.
Around, like, someone comes to us and says, we want you to be, that content in the middle to be much more, or less abstract, less about table, the village.
And more bespoke.
More specific around our particular problem. And I think we're challenged with that as to whether we think that's the right approach, maybe, because I think often when you're working in those projects, it really depends on how far that conversation has gone with those groups. So I could see this being a really great, irrespective of what the problem is, this being a really great initial workshop with people, just to kind of get to know each other, rather than like jumping in straight into this is the problem, blah, blah, blah. It's almost like maybe it could be that kind of rules of combat, if you like, where people get to understand each other and kind of like before it goes deeper.
Yeah.
Obviously, there might be ways of like having steps or what have you to it, and stages to it. But again, that's part of the R&D and seeing where we kind of get. I guess if you were to describe where you would like to be by the end of the kind of this R&D, do you have any thoughts on terms of goals or desires? Because currently, I guess just to run it back a bit, while we said we've run it a few times, it's very much hand cranked, like all of us are chipping in to turn off microphones, turn on microphones, turn off speakers, turn on speakers, do some of the food, that kind of stuff. So it's all been very much like delivered manually, like behind the curtain, if you like Wizard of Ozing, where it looks like maybe it's automatic, but it's very much hand cranked. So yeah, it's not like there's really anything that there's a few bits of kind of bespokeness, but it's very off the shelf, and a lot of kind of hiding different apps being played at different times and used in different ways, different AI agents being used at different times.
Yeah, I guess we are part of the team. We're working with an AI engineer who is going to be working with us to technically make a system that is much more robust and fit for purpose for what we want. So that will allow us to have more control, will allow us to be able to kind of really do the things that we want to do in relation to it having the flexibility to maybe stretch into those different spaces that we've just described, in terms of it's a supper club, thought experiment, social experience, and that has a certain format, or that it is a bespoke workshop for somebody who has some really key parameters and content, even, so that we can run those two variations, but then also have control of the data as well, and that data is secure and safe in relation to each workshop that we run, so that there's much more kind of walls around those elements. And then by the end of the R&D, I think what I would like, but I'm not sure it's really possible, is looking at that, controlling that cause and consequence, so that, let's say, supper club 1 happens, and then a next group comes in, which let's call supper club 2. They inherit that cause and consequence from the group before, and so on and so on. So it does become this growing organic entity or space that people can come in and change and go away, and maybe in 6 months' time they come back to the village of table, and some things are familiar and other things perhaps aren't. So that ability for it to be like an experience in that sense, I think would be really interesting. So technically working towards that solution, I think, is where I'd quite like it to be, so that we do have that ability for it to remember. 6 months ago, Julian had said that he wanted to create an orchard in the village of Table, and then I came back in 2 months and the orchard had flourished. You know what I mean? I can pick the apples from the saplings that were planted. That kind of thing, and similar to like world building games, where you can kind of see things grow, or see things change, I think is where cause that's what most excites me about the project.
Cool.
What about you? What most excites you about the project?
I think up until this point, we've not known everyone that has taken part. I think we've run it 4 times, with anywhere between 4 and 6 people every time. And maybe we've directly known 30%, 40% of the people that have come. We've known of them, but like not, maybe more friends or acquaintances. I think I'm excited to maybe explore this with a group of people we don't know it may be a space we're a bit more unfamiliar with, and just seeing how that works and see if that does change it. I definitely like, in a similar vein to you, I definitely love the idea of this kind of cause and consequence thing. It feels some way off, and it does feel like it's almost like an additional element depending on how you visualize it or how you kind of read it. But maybe there's ways within the R&D that we come across and it's kind of quite a simple, easy win. But I guess if there was one thing that I'm really excited about, I really want to explore how we can do the entrance into the kind of experience. We've spoken about it a fair bit as to almost like a 90s to early 2000s kind of exhibition of like the table and the village, and then they come into the actual dining area. And so I guess I am leaning towards the kind of overall experience theatrical element. And yeah, it is, in a sense, it's probably one of the, if we are thinking along the lines more of theatrical, moving away from pure function, it does become something that's a community engagement, artistic expression. And that does loosen up some boundaries as to how we can push it. Probably makes it less likely that it could be funded in the future. But it is interesting to see maybe how you could work with that initial bit to immerse people into the history of the table village, and kind of get them in a state of mind even more before they kind of enter the dining room area. It would be great if we could do that, and it would be great if we could look at one of the big problems or challenges we're having at the minute is pure capacity. Looking at how we can improve capacity or increase capacity. The AI listening to multiple people, it's not a strong point currently. There's definitely abilities for it to do that, but it's still not brilliant. So some of our R&D is around that as well. So yeah, I think that initial bit, and then maybe just seeing how much you can push it, really, I think would be really interesting. I think that's about. That's the ones I'd kind of really focused on. If we have enough time and enough kind of like we get that far down the line of it. Yeah.
And I think, with all of these technologies which are just so all encompassing at the minute, and I think many people, as soon as you say the word AI, it's quite an unknown and scary element, really. And I suppose it's sort of like seeing this as a way or a tool to using it as a tool for good. So how can you kind of like turn it on its head and manipulate it in a way that serves a good purpose, because the intention of that purpose is good and positive. So some kind of, I don't know, compassionate anarchy of the technology in some way. I'm kind of like keen on thinking about it in that respect and in that light.
There's the old analogy, isn't it, that technology is neither evil or good. And I think the more and more you kind of think about that, the more and more I disbelieve that, the more and more you feel like most of the technologies that have been developed more recently, people have known that it's going to potentially make them billionaires, trillionaires, etc. It feels maybe in the infancy of social media and those kind of technologies, you could believe that people genuinely thought they were making stuff for good. But now it just feels very much transactional, and they know that this stuff is like bordering on damaging. It definitely is damaging for some people. So yeah, I think it is trying to make the case for some of these things to be able to be of value in a positive sense. I think that's come to us fairly late, really, in a sense. Like the intention of the piece was always that, and the technology was to enable that. But as you kind of see how quickly AI is kind of like both developing and then also creating content, nearly every single time you look on one of the social media platforms now, you're seeing posts that are almost getting to the level where they're indistinguishable to whether they're a real post or AI. And generally the second or third question in that post is this AI? And then the next person says, yeah, it is. And you're like, okay, fine. But already you've seen it. So I think your brain has already think that's truth. So yeah, it'd be nice to kind of try and harness some of these things for a slightly more positive outlook. I definitely think that's the case.
You've been listening to Crafted Reality. And don't forget, if you've been enjoying the podcast, you can support us on our Patreon page. And also please share, like and subscribe with anyone that you think might be interested. We'll see you again next month.